August 14, 1943. Norfolk Navy Yard, Portsmouth, Virginia. Early morning light fights through a low Atlantic fog as a line of gray trucks cough to a halt beyond the chain-link fence. The air tastes of salt and oil. Gulls wheel above like in different centuries. Men in olive-gray uniforms step down from the trucks with hands bound and eyes still rimmed with exhaustion. They are Germans, a mix of Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe prisoners, brought across the ocean from North Africa and the Mediterranean, the captured remnants of lost campaigns. Their leader, Hauptmann Karl Weber, 42, face creased from too much sun and not enough food, shoulders a canvas pack and moves with the practiced restraint of an officer. Beside him, Feldwebel Hans Muller wipes grease from a bandaged hand and squints through the mist, searching for the barbed silhouette of what should be an American camp, an American town, anything familiar. You stand with them, pressed to the fence, as if proximity will explain the strange new world. Over the yard, a distant clang rises, metal on metal, a staccato that feels less like war and more like construction. Then a smell cuts through the salt and diesel, hot iron and burning paint, a sharp, almost metallic sweetness. It is a smell no one in Weber's unit expected to find in the United States of America. Inside the yard, past warehouses painted in industrial gray, a factory roofline bristles with cranes and smokestacks. Through the open doors roll machines as vast as train cars, and a river of people moves beneath them, hands steady at presses, faces fixed on blueprints, arms lifting and lowering in rhythm. At the gate, an American sergeant with a broad jaw and a clipboard, Corporal James "Jimmy" Hayes, 30, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, studies the prisoners as if cataloging curiosities. He watches them watch the factory floor. They'll get a look at home before long, he says to no one, voice low. The prisoners are led by a short path that runs along the factory's outer wall. There is a pause as Weber's boots crunch on gravel. Then the fence parts, and they are inside, close enough to make out the machines. Towering punch presses, rivet guns that hiss like angry insects, conveyor lines carrying shapes that will fit into something the size of a war, wing spars, hull plates, propeller hubs. Women in coveralls move among the equipment, their hair bound under scarves, grease on forearms, safety goggles perched on brows. They lift heavy jigs without flinching. They strike blocks of hot metal with pneumatic hammers, sparks bursting like miniature fireworks. For a moment, everything freezes, not in the sense of time stopping, but in the prisoner's comprehension. Hans squares his shoulders, a gesture meant to steady the unit, and the others imitate him. Their faces say what their voices cannot: disbelief. Weber, trained to read an enemy's weakness, reads only anomaly. Are those women? He asks, the German words brittle in the open air. He expects derision, perhaps an explanation that softens reality into propaganda. Instead, the world beyond the fence keeps moving. The press operator, a woman in her 20s with a freckled face and a bandana knotted behind her head, barks instructions into a loudspeaker and the machine responds, obedient and precise. The scene is not the polished tableau of a poster. This is grease and grit and the heat of 1,000 small emergencies solved by hands that have learned to be quick with both clamp and smile. Margaret Maggie Thompson, plant forewoman, tall and square-shouldered, hears the trucks and steps toward the gate. She is 40, her name the sort the foremen say with a mix of admiration and irritation because she knows metrics better than most. Her boots slap the concrete. Maggie's knuckles are raw from handling rivet guns. Her voice carries the authority of a forewoman who has earned every hour in the yard. She meets the prisoner's eyes and does not offer explanation or apology, only a glance that asks a simple question. What do you see? What they see, instead, is a reversal of the world they left. In Germany, mothers were mothers and soldiers were soldiers. Factories were male sanctuaries, guarded and hierarchical. Here, women are both, mothers and metalworkers, clerks and welders, union organizers and shipfitters. They operate oxyacetylene torches worth more than the pay of a junior officer. They balance on scaffolds the height of barn roofs while guiding hull plates into place. A woman in a grease-streaked apron plants a rivet with a pneumatic gun the size of a walking stick. A shower of incandescent chips jumps from the seam like bright rain. The Germans' mouths hang open slightly. It is a small, dangerous thing to expose in captivity. Hans studies a riveter's strong wrists, the muscle work revealed beneath a rolled sleeve. And in that study there is the slow movement of myth reconfiguring into fact. Around them, the factory hums with a language of tools and timesheets. Whistles call brakes. Radios spout the day's news between clatter. The smell of sweat and motor oil blends into a kind of ritual that feeds the war machine. A Liberty ship keel that began as mere steel ingots will, by nightfall, be closer to floating than any single man imagined before breakfast. Women guide the assembly like seasoned navigators. They shout measurements and corrections. They laugh once at a dropped bolt and then return to work. For the Germans, every sound feels like evidence. Evidence that power is not only in tanks and guns, but in the steady, relentless multiplication of skilled hands. Hauptmann Weber thinks of his hometown in Bavaria, of quiet carpentry shops and men who returned from work with darkened hands and a kind of private dignity. This is different, a public dignity, loud and unapologetic. He feels, for the first time since the war began, a cold, unwelcome recognition. The enemy he thought he knew is not only on a battlefield. It is in a downtown factory, in a woman's arm that can strike a rivet into place faster than a squad can reload. He has not yet found the English words to describe it. He looks at his men and sees their faces, each one cataloging the same impossible images, and he knows they will carry these memories back to barbed wire nights and to the officers' reports that will attempt to chew and digest what they cannot swallow. The prisoners were marched past the factory and into the camp beyond it, a fenced compound built hastily beside the docks, the kind of place designed not for cruelty but for containment. Wooden barracks stretched in rows, the smell of pine and soap hanging over them. The guards were young, many barely out of high school, and most carried themselves with an ease that baffled the Germans. This was not the posture of victors in a total war. It was the quiet confidence of men who believed the outcome was already written. Inside Barak 4, Hauptmann Weber sat by the window, the hum of machinery still audible from the shipyard. He could see the cranes swinging, sparks falling like orange snow in the distance. For an officer who had served through Poland, France, and North Africa, this new front, the industrial front, was invisible yet overwhelming. Every rivet, every bolt, every uniform stained with oil felt like another weapon pointed at Germany. Muller dropped onto the lower bunk, rubbing his temples. "They work like soldiers," he muttered. "But they're not soldiers." Weber didn't answer. His gaze drifted beyond the fence toward the women in blue overalls. A train whistle cut the air, sharp and triumphant, followed by the groan of locomotives hauling flat cars loaded with bomber fuselages. Each car carried the weight of months of design and manpower, yet it moved smoothly, effortlessly. The realization settled in Weber's chest like a stone. This is how they fight. 2 days later, the prisoners were assigned labor around the perimeter, collecting scrap, unloading crates, sweeping the loading areas. The Americans wanted them to see. Whether it was intentional or not, every task brought them closer to the heartbeat of the factory. They passed through workshops filled with noise that was almost orchestral in its precision, drills, hammers, presses, all moving to an unseen rhythm. Hans Muller found himself near the paint section, where bombers' wings were coated in gray primer. He stole glances at the workers, girls barely 20, sleeves rolled up, cigarettes tucked behind ears. One of them, her name stitched on her overalls, Azzy Matthews, noticed his stare. She smiled. Not mockingly, not triumphantly, just a quick, human smile before turning back to her spray gun. It disarmed him more than a pistol ever could. He turned to another prisoner and said under his breath, "If they can build bombers like that, we can't win." The other man, older and grim, didn't argue. He simply nodded, eyes fixed on the ceiling cranes lifting a completed wing like a relic ascending into light. In the administrative office overlooking the plant floor, forewoman Maggie Thompson reviewed production charts with Captain Hayes. "We're 2 weeks ahead," she said, flipping through the sheets, grease still visible on her hands. Hayes grinned. "That'll make the brass happy. Those boys down there," he nodded toward the POWs in gray, "look like they just saw ghosts." "They saw work," Maggie replied. "That's scarier than ghosts." She looked down at the Germans, shuffling through the aisles with wheelbarrows of metal scrap. They thought we'd fold, she continued. They don't understand what happens when we get mad. Weeks passed. The POWs settled into routine, their disbelief fading into something quieter, reflection, perhaps even respect. They learned the names of the machines, the rhythm of shift changes, the American songs that spilled from radios mounted near the welding stations. One afternoon, Weber stood near the main gate as a group of women clocked out. He counted, dozens, hundreds, streaming past in denim, their hair tied back, faces streaked with soot. They laughed about milk rations, husbands overseas, movie nights, rent. Yet they moved with the posture of builders, conquerors of matter itself. A jeep rolled by, its horn blaring. The women waved to the guard, who tipped his helmet. One of them carried a lunchbox painted with the words, "Do the job," he left behind. The phrase struck Weber harder than any artillery shell. He realized that every man Germany had captured, every tank it had destroyed, every bomb it had dropped, America had already replaced it, built anew, improved upon it. And it wasn't men doing it. It was women. Thousands of them. Millions. He thought of the Reich's propaganda films, of Hitler's speeches about destiny and strength, and for the first time, those words felt brittle, like glass ready to shatter under the weight of a hammer. That night, in the barracks, Weber wrote in his journal, a small, brown notebook he'd managed to keep since Tunisia. The enemy is not what we believed. They have no single face, no single army. Their power is in their people, in their unity. They have turned factories into fortresses, and their women fight with fire and iron. He paused, listening to the faint whistle of the night train leaving the docks, its flat cars heavy with bombers headed toward Europe. The same Europe he once commanded troops to defend. Outside, the factory lights burned all night. The machines never slept. By October 1943, the air around Norfolk hung thick with the smell of industry, a mixture of hot steel, welding fumes, and the faint sweetness of oil-soaked wood. The shipyards were at full capacity, working shifts around the clock. From the POW camp, the Germans could see the dockside cranes moving even at midnight, their spotlights slicing through the coastal fog like the eyes of restless giants. The war, for them, had become a symphony of machinery. Hauptmann Weber had begun to keep meticulous notes. Every sound, every new type of rivet gun or crane, became an entry in his journal. It wasn't espionage, it was all disguised as analysis. He wanted to understand what made the Americans so unstoppable. One evening, after supper, cornbread, beans, and strong coffee, he sat on the barrack steps watching the horizon glow orange with furnace light. "They don't fight the way we do," he said quietly to Muller. Muller leaned back, folding his arms. "No, they don't fight with pride. They fight with production." The words hung there, sharp and truthful. Across the fence, a shift whistle blew, and a new wave of workers poured in. Women again, hundreds of them, some still wearing aprons from home, others already covered in grime from previous shifts. A few carried lunchboxes plastered with pictures of their husbands or sons in uniform. Every one of them looked determined, focused, relentless. Weber couldn't look away. "They've replaced the soldier with the citizen," he murmured. Muller nodded. "And the citizen doesn't surrender." The camp chaplain, an older American named Reverend Jenkins, sometimes visited the prisoners. He wasn't there to preach politics, only to talk. One afternoon, he found Weber reading near the fence. "You write a lot," Jenkins said, leaning on the wire. "I record what I see," Weber answered. "I have seen something I was told could not exist." Jenkins smiled faintly. "You mean women in a shipyard?" Weber considered the question, then shook his head. "No, I mean a nation that trusts its women with victory." For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of machinery filled the silence between them. Then Jenkins said softly, "That's what you call freedom, son. It's noisy, but it works." A week later, the Germans were assigned to unload timber near the docks. The smell of sawdust mixed with diesel smoke as forklifts moved in rhythmic precision. Overhead, an aircraft carrier loomed, the USS Ticonderoga, new and gleaming, nearly ready for launch. American workers swarmed its deck like ants on a steel anthill. Among them were dozens of women, their faces half hidden behind welding masks, sparks flying in white arcs around their boots. One of the POWs, a young Bavarian private named Otto Kruger, whispered, "In Germany, a woman would never be allowed near a warship." Muller laughed quietly, a sound half of irony and half of admiration. That's why they'll win. Later that evening, as rain began to fall in thin, silvery sheets, Weber walked along the inner perimeter, his boots sinking slightly in the mud. The guard tower lights glowed faintly through the drizzle. He thought of his wife back in Augsburg, Anna, who had been forbidden by rationing laws to work outside the home. He wondered what she would think of these American women, these Rosies with rivet guns and blue scarves. Would she be frightened? Inspired? He didn't know. What he did know was that something inside him, the old certainty, the arrogance that had driven their cause, was beginning to erode. The Reich had promised that discipline, unity, and ideology would conquer the world. But here, across the ocean, he saw chaos, laughter, noise, motion, all bound together by purpose, not fear. And somehow, that was stronger. At night, when the guards dimmed the lights and the camp fell quiet, Weber's mind returned to the sound of hammering. It had become the rhythm of his captivity, steady, tireless, almost maternal in its repetition. It was the sound of a civilization building its own destiny from steel and sweat. One morning before dawn, he woke to the roar of sirens and the groan of machinery. Peering through the barrack window, he saw it, the Ticonderoga, sliding down the slipway into the dark water, fireworks of steam and sparks exploding as it touched the sea. Workers cheered. Whistles blared. American flags waved beneath the mist. And there, in the front row, stood Maggie Thompson, goggles still on her forehead, one fist raised as the ship vanished into the harbor. Weber pressed his hand to the cold glass. He whispered, "This is how empires are built, not with conquest, but with creation." In the weeks that followed, more German prisoners arrived. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened and skeptical. But when they saw the factories, the women, the endless trains of materials moving toward the ports, their skepticism melted into the same stunned silence. The war was far from over, but in those American yards, behind those fences, a different kind of victory was already being forged, one of willpower, equality, and motion. For every rivet, there was a heartbeat. For every ship, a story. And for every prisoner staring through the wire, a growing awareness that Germany had underestimated not just America's men, but its women. The rhythm of hammers never stopped. Winter arrived early in Virginia. By December 1943, frost painted the dock rails white each morning, and steam rose in ghostly veils from the chimneys of the shipyards. Inside the POW camp, guards wore scarves beneath their helmets, and the prisoners huddled close to the stoves that crackled in their barracks. Yet beyond the wire, the factories never slowed. The rhythm of work, the clang of metal, and the flash of molten sparks continued as though the very idea of winter had no authority there. Weber rose before dawn most days, drawn once again to the fence line. He'd stand with his hands in his coat pockets, breath curling in the cold air, watching the procession begin, the workers arriving on bicycles and buses, their lunch pails swinging like pendulums of time. The women greeted one another with laughter, their breath misting like smoke, their boots crunching through the frost as they entered the great gates of the yard. The sight had become ritual to him, an American liturgy of labor. Each morning began with the same sound, the factory whistle, long and resonant, echoing across the harbor like a church bell. One morning, a new guard, Private Davis, approached him. "You keep watching that yard like you're talking notes for a novel," he joked. Weber gave a faint smile. "Perhaps I am." Davis shifted the rifle on his shoulder. "You ever see something like that back home?" "No," Weber answered quietly. "In Germany, such a thing would be impossible. Women belong to the hearth, to the children. That is what we were told." Davis looked toward the cranes, the smoke, the women already working at the torches. Guess no one told them that. By late January, word reached the camp that the Allies had landed at Anzio. The war was moving again, and with it came the steady pulse of victory shipments. Crates of artillery shells, bomb racks, new tanks rolling out of American ports bound for Europe. To the German prisoners, every outbound ship was a reminder. The industrial tide was too vast to resist. In the evenings, the POWs sometimes heard the radio from the guards' quarters. Swing music, victory speeches, updates from the front. The voice of Franklin D. Roosevelt cut through the static one night, his tone calm but commanding. The production of our war industry is the arsenal of democracy, and every worker, man or woman, is a soldier on that front. The men in Barack 4 sat in silence, listening through the wooden walls. Muller shook his head slowly. He speaks of them as soldiers, and they believe it. Weber stared at the dark ceiling. They don't just believe it, he said softly. They live it. A few days later, Maggie Thompson led a team through the shipyard for an inspection tour. They passed within sight of the POW compound. Some prisoners were out stacking crates, and the guards allowed a brief pause as she walked by. The men watched her. This woman who commanded more workers than many of them had ever commanded soldiers. She stopped for a moment, wiping grease from her palms, and looked toward the camp. For a second, just a heartbeat, her gaze met Weber's. There was no animosity there, no pride or contempt. Only acknowledgement. Two people who understood the machinery of war in different ways. Weber gave a small nod. She returned it, then turned and walked back into the roar of her factory. In the barracks that night, Weber wrote again. The women here build ships the way our engineers once built dreams. They do not ask for permission. They simply act. This is the enemy we face, not hatred, but capability. I wonder if the men who started this war ever imagined being defeated by such hands. He closed the notebook and listened to the night outside. Somewhere beyond the yard, a train was leaving, wheels clattering like distant thunder. The other prisoners slept. Muller snored softly in the bunk below. Weber thought of his wife again, of Anna, of the life they might have had if the world had taken a different path. He imagined her in a scarf like Maggie's, welding steel for victory instead of waiting for letters that never came. For the first time since capture, a strange warmth filled his chest. Not pride, not sorrow, but admiration. He realized that history was shifting in real time, not just on battlefields, but in factories, in homes, in the hands of women who had refused to stay silent or idle. The future of war, of nations, perhaps even of humanity, would belong to those hands. When the war finally ended 2 years later, and the prisoners were returned to a defeated Germany, many would carry with them stories that no propaganda could erase. Stories of laughter in the factories, of women who built ships faster than men could destroy them, of freedom loud enough to drown out the noise of ideology. And among those stories was the image burned forever into Weber's mind. A woman standing before a newly launched ship, her fist raised against the light of dawn. A symbol of a nation that had found its strength not in conquest, but in creation.